Welcome back to The Sower, a podcast of the Ciceronian Society. The Ciceronian Society is an interdisciplinary group of Christian scholars devoted to the study of three themes: tradition, place, and things divine. To find out more about us, please visit our website, ciceroniansociety.org. I'm your host, Christopher Annadale, and my guest today is Rachel Ferguson, who is the director of the Free Enterprise Center at Concordia University of Chicago, an affiliated scholar at the Acton Institute, a member of the Ciceronian Society Advisory Board, a longtime conference attendee, and a great friend of mine from 20 years ago when I was working in Missouri. Rachel, welcome back to The Sower.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be back.
It's fantastic to talk with you again. Now, you were you were an interviewee of ours on The Sower maybe 2 years ago when we first started. We talked about your book, Black Liberation Through the Marketplace.
I think I was episode 2 or something. I was very early.
It's one of the very first ones. So I'm glad to have you back again to talk about a related topic. My inspiration for asking you to be on this episode was a panel at the Ciceronian Society's annual conference last month, that's March 2025, in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Our plenary panel, which opened the conference, was about Seth Kaplan's book, Fragile Neighborhoods: Repairing American Society, One Zip Code at a Time. We were talking about urban renewal, about the different ways in which are effective and ineffective in trying to bring life and order back to some parts of the country and of the cities that are suffering socially, economically, and in other ways. And you spoke on that panel, in addition to a number of other people. I remember being really impressed by your comments and thinking that I wanted to hear more. So I wonder if you'd start us out just by maybe reprising some of what you had said to the panel, and we can maybe take it further there about the sort of the present needs of neighborhood stabilization and urban recovery.
Yeah, so I really love the book. I want to say that. Kaplan is great. He does great research. One of the things I love most about Fragile Neighborhoods is his emphasis on horizontal connection. So oftentimes we think in terms of either top down or bottom up. And of course, we're bottom up people. But we have to remember that part of what's been lost in our destabilized neighborhoods is that social capital, right? A lot of those civil society institutions have been deeply weakened, right? Family, church, fraternal associations, et cetera, which used to be very strong, by the way. I'm particularly thinking of Black urban communities, which in the 1950s had incredibly high rates of participation in all of those institutions. And so we're looking at a terrible destabilization of that. So I love the way he talks about how we have to foster connection and trust. Part of the interesting thing about studying a little bit of economics and international economics is understanding that much of the problem in international economics in terms of development is a lack of trust. You can't trust the court systems, you can't trust each other, you can't, right? And so the more you have that sort of situation, people aren't entering into cooperative endeavors. And that's exactly what we're seeing in many of our own destabilized neighborhoods. So I love the book. I highly recommend it. With regard to anything critical, I might say, basically, I wanted to bring up the concept of natural scale. And of course, you and I are very familiar with this, Chris. We used to talk about it at all our old conferences.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I'm deeply influenced by this notion of natural scale, of course, the work of our friend Don Livingston, who's so good on this topic. Thinking about, what scale things need to be at in order for them to function well. Mm-hmm. And so if we're talking about a neighborhood, what do we mean by a neighborhood? And Seth had to contend with a little bit of back and forth on that on the panel, because he's thinking really of a 5,000 or 6,000 person area. And I understand why you might use the word neighborhood in that way. But that's a lot of people. If you go back to Aristotle, he's thinking of a whole society that's 5,000 or 6,000 people, not just a neighborhood, right? So what I wanted to challenge him on is the sense in which we can really plan at the proper scale. So if you think of like F.A. Hayek and his critique of central planning, He's not saying that families don't plan. He's not saying that small businesses don't plan. He's not saying that, voluntary associations don't plan. They all plan and have rational plans. It's the collection of those rational plans into a spontaneous order that is not itself centrally planned, right? That's the point. And so
Right.
I've been heavily influenced by people like Bob Lupton, his book Toxic Charity, and Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center, and people like John Perkins, Christian Community Development Association. And what they're saying is, there's actually kind of a vision of block by block renewal. Because here's how I would put it. For many of these residents, our neighbors living in destabilized areas, their whole world can be a 4 to 6 block area because there's gang territories,
Mhm.
right? There's huge economic barriers like highways that are stopping them from going any further. And so what's the point? The point is that if that's your whole world, you're not even relating necessarily to the next 4 to 6 block area, right? But if I want to make a difference in your life, I can't say, hey, come over here 3 miles away to my program where I'm going to teach you something. I've got to come to you and I've got to be in your world, right? And I'm thinking of young people who might think of, running and gunning as their only option, right? Running drugs
Yeah.
or whatever it might be. That's what they're seeing. That's what they're around. But they're also seeing their older brothers and cousins getting shot in the streets, going to prison for murder. All of those things are very real. And so it's not necessarily, oh, this is my dream of what I really want to be. It can often be, this is the only thing I know. And so how do you bring a different world onto someone's block in a way that's humanly meaningful to them? They're walking down the street on a Saturday morning, watching the community gardens being built, and they stop and go, what's going on? And you say, hey, if you want to work, we can pay you. And that's how you get those young teens going, right? And then all of a sudden, their whole vista opens up to a possibly different future than the ones that their older brothers and cousins have experienced. So that's sort of how my comments began with the Kaplan stuff.
That's great. I remember that very well, and this is one of the things I had wanted to ask you more about. Let me try separating the question of scale into two different issues, and you let me know if you think that these are distinct and maybe deserve separate answers. The first question, it seems to me, is a question of scale as size. Like, at what level of social organization do we attempt to address these problems? At what level will those attempts be most likely to be successful? Are we dealing with block by block or six block area by 6 block area, or can we go as large as 6 or 8 thousand person sort of sub unit of the city? And then the second sense, I think, the sense of scale maybe as a verb. Like once we have the solution, we have something that works, does it scale up? Can it be applied to more in other areas or larger areas? Or is it going to be limited to that particular sort of human scale of urban social organization? What do you think about that distinction and the answers to those two questions?
Yeah, really interesting. All right. So I really want to defend the notion that we do have to attack the problem on a block by block basis. I want to be clear, attack in what way, right? What I'm talking about are highly relational person to person efforts to stabilize a block, which is certainly different from, let's say, like a strong towns kind of concept, where you're thinking about the layout of the roads or of the park, right? Or where the stoplights are. Obviously, you need to go a little broader in order to do that kind of work well. So I think it sort of depends on what part of the process you're talking about. But what I'm thinking of are neighborhoods where truly the most fundamental elements of functioning human life have in many ways been lost. Marriage, family, the church has been weakened. It's definitely still there, but it has been weakened, I think, by the loss of family, and certainly employment and work. In that regard, the issues of sort of bitterness and hopelessness and mistrust are so deep in the actual people in the neighborhood that it's really not possible to take a larger group, right, and try and stabilize them. What you need to do, I would argue, and I'm getting this from Bob Woodson, is you need to find the Josephs. Okay, so the Josephs are his term for the person on the block, and sometimes there's several, who really are trying their darndest. They have a deep love for their neighborhood. They want to help the young people. They want to keep it nice. They want to, deal with crime. They're doing what they can, oftentimes on a shoestring. They're running on fumes. And what he's saying is these people often can do what you cannot do as an outsider. And so why? Because they have more local knowledge and they have more credibility. And so once you empower the Joseph, right? And of course, he's naming this after Joseph from the Bible, who the Pharaoh realized was the only one who could solve the problem. Pharaoh was rich, but he didn't have the solution, right?
Right.
Joseph had the solution. And what did Pharaoh think? He thought, put him in charge of the whole deal, right? Put him in charge. And that's really what we need to do. We need to empower the neighborhood leaders to be in charge. Okay, so then when we ask about scale, I'll never forget, or scaling up, I should say, the second part, your second dichotomy there. I'll never forget an interview I did with a guy named Aaron. He runs a wonderful ministry here in St. Louis called Harambe. And Harambe is in North City, and they teach young people how to lay brick. And the thing about this is that St. Louis is a city made of brick, and so they'll never run out of work if they know how to lay brick and how to tuck point. But Aaron was coming at it as a Presbyterian minister. And so for him, these kids became his kids. They had him in their phone as dad, right? So he's employing these kids. He can't go to the next block. He can't go past, 100 or 150 kids. There's no ability to scale it up in that area, even if he's got 200 people on his waiting list. So I remember saying to him, Aaron, why don't you scale up, right? Why don't you get more people so that you can train the next 200 kids? He says, no, I don't need to do that. Somebody 3 blocks over needs to do that, right? So I think there is a sense in which you can absolutely scale this model, but it's not a matter of one organization becoming bigger. It's a matter of those Josephs and the organizations that support them being found in every place, right? So you have more and more people catching the vision and then going to the next neighborhood over and making that next neighborhood successful. In fact, if we think about sort of the hopelessness of our progressive policies when it comes to destabilized neighborhoods, we might say, hey guys, it's been 60 years now. We've been trying all of this stuff, so don't tell me that it takes too long. It takes 8 to 10 years to stabilize a block, according to Bob Lupton, and that's exactly what I've seen with the organization I'm involved with here in St. Louis, Love the Lou. If a lot of people were stabilizing a lot of blocks, it could all get done in 8 to 10 years, right? And then I'm sure plenty of follow-up. The problem is just that there aren't, right? We don't have enough people doing that kind of work.
It sounds like it's just the mindset of efficiency and centralization, right? Where you do scale up because you get economies of scale and you get the most competent people working with the largest possible impact. That's exactly what you don't have. And is it because this kind of neighborhood stabilization is attached to the specific place? That it's people will stay here because this is their home, this is their 6-block area. They don't perhaps go beyond. They're not considering relocating to somewhere else. Is there a place theme, you think, with that?
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a really interesting question for me because, one of the areas where, one of the next people you should have on the podcast is someone who can think deeply about these same questions, but in rural settings, where you have dispersed poverty as opposed to concentrated poverty. And
Absolutely.
The reason that is because, everybody knows when you talk about small town America that you can't just say to a small town that, whose industry has left, okay, everybody move to the city so you can be, have trucking jobs or whatever the jobs are. Nobody says that, right? because you understand that there's a strong sense of place and that people want to make their place work. And so we need to figure out how to develop economies in that situation. I think, of course, the same is true for these neighborhoods in the city, many of whom, they have these matriarchs who can remember the days when the neighborhood was functioning beautifully and when there was a strong sense of community and when there were shops on the corner and when it was considered a really nice area. And that's within their lifetimes, right? And so there's no sense in which we want to simply tell people to move. On the other hand, I want to be clear here. Many people do move. And the issue is that doesn't actually solve the problem. Because if you have destabilized families, if you're destabilized spiritually, if you've lost some of the habits involved in business, like saving and things like that, even being banked in some cases, moving to a different neighborhood, even a much nicer neighborhood, even a suburban neighborhood, doesn't actually solve any of those fundamental problems. And so what we often find is people who sort of take their problems with them. And then you have a new neighborhood where, it slowly starts to become destabilized, right? And so as a St. Louis resident, I work in Chicago, but I live in St. Louis. I go back and forth. We have the same problems in Chicago, so you can apply it to both. I can see how, the people in the county, sort of don't want to think about the problems in the city, and they don't want to be bothered with it because the corruption is so annoying. It's all very frustrating. But the fact is that it's just a problem that continues to spread, right? It's not as though you can really get away from it. And so saying, well, we're just going to create our little enclave and we're not going to worry about that really isn't a solution either. And so from my perspective, I would encourage people to actually stay and rebuild their neighborhood, which can be hard to do because once you get young people that are successful, they often want to go somewhere else, right? So you have to think about how to do that and actually have a vision for long-term rebuilding. And then you have this whole other question of gentrification, which is really an interesting one. Because economically, you can certainly show that actually gentrification does tend to raise all boats. You hate to say it, but, that's what the numbers show. But that's just material well-being. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are any less isolated. They might be more isolated, et cetera. And so how can we do what Lupton would call gentrification with justice? In other words, how can we have the stable community members be able to remain by helping them to own their property, by helping to cap property taxes, things like that, while bringing in different income levels so that you have actual employment networks, because that you really do need that.
We're talking about this problem, and of course, it's a material problem. It's an economic problem. It's a people and human resources and human development problem. We're talking about it in terms of politics and kind of sociology as well. But you and I are both philosophers, so maybe I could ask a question, and maybe this is more interesting to you and I than to the whole audience. Is there a need for some more correct theory of society or understanding of human nature at the basis of all of this, if it's really going to work? Because it sounds like there's not going to be we're not going to one-shot this, right? It's not going to be finding a certain kind of political structure that is going to fix things. It's going to be sort of sticking in for the long haul in a very small community, which is suffering tremendously at first, and improving it by degrees. What are your thoughts on that as a philosopher?
Oh, absolutely. So, the really obvious whipping boy here are the progressives who, we can say really clearly miss out on human nature by thinking of us as purely material beings. If you meet my material needs, then I'll be fine, right? I won't be committing crime, et cetera. I won't be joining gangs. Well, guess why people join gangs? It's because they want family. That's why. It's because they want family. It's because young men want to have older men who care about them, right? There's much deeper problems than just material, a lack of material goods. I'll never forget watching an interview with Angela Davis, and she talked about freedom dreaming and how if we could just take all the resources that we're putting into policing and prisons and just give the money to the people, then they wouldn't have to commit crimes. Right. And I'm thinking, dear Lord, how can you be so confused about how human life really works? sort of the scientific mindset. I can move you around like pieces on a chessboard. We've seen that with our terrible welfare, the projects, right? Like Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis is a famous one, but there's many famous ones that just failed miserably. And they look like Soviet-style buildings even, with 18 lined up. I mean, it looks like something out of a futuristic dystopia, and then you wonder why it didn't work. So that's a really obvious one. But I think that we can get closer to maybe criticizing ourselves a little bit as people who might identify with the term conservative, and be thinking about human nature in a deeper, more spiritual and moral sense. I still get frustrated with us, Chris, because a lot of conservatives will love to beat up progressives for their failed state-run solutions. And I'm happy to do that. I've got whole chapters of my book on that sort of stuff. But then they'll turn around and take a highly bureaucratic approach to charity, right? And so they're looking for some huge organization that's doing what? Oftentimes just giving people things, the very things that we criticize about the welfare state, that it's not really going to the root of the problem within our human nature. We then turn around and support ourselves with our dollars and our time. It's very frustrating. On the other hand, I want to say I do feel that there is a bit of a renaissance occurring in this regard. And so we do see, number one, I think it's pretty normal now for people to, critique some of our efforts, like just as an example, short-term mission trips. It's not that unusual now for people to joke about the short-term mission trip where you painted the school for the third time, that summer, because they just needed something for the poverty tourists to do. Now, I'm not saying all short-term mission trips are like that, but some are, right? And so there's some more awareness happening. I think the struggle is people don't know how to get from A to B. So they're taking in the philosophical critique, but they don't know how to make the practical change. And so we've got a couple of really great organizations working on this. One is called True Charity. True Charity. It actually started working on mostly rural poverty in Southwest Missouri. They're now a national organization associated with the Chalmers Center, Brian Fickert's book, When Helping Hurts. Their founder, James Whitford, just came out with a book called The Crisis of Dependency. And what they do is they actually have tried and true ways that organizations, churches can take their model of just handing things out to people in a very non-relational, faceless kind of way. And they can actually shift it to an exchange model where you're getting to know people, you're bonding with them, you're making distinctions between relief and development. You're actually able to walk through life with people and get them into a much more stable place. So I really love that. And of course, the book Toxic Charity by Bob Lupton addresses this. But I do think conservatives kind of need to turn inward, and look at ourselves. How are we just imitating the state? Like Marvin Olasky argued in The Tragedy of American Compassion. How did we just take what the progressives decided to do, in the middle of the 19th century and then just imitate it ourselves? It's a frustrating problem, but it's one that I think we're just starting to really see a change. So that's exciting.
It certainly sounds like there's some relevance for a localist-minded movement, conservatism or progressivism, a sort of renewed neighborhood pride or whatnot, that's sort of getting past what I think of as being the kind of mid-20th century, like 3 or 4 decades post-war obsession with the Leviathan state, the central planning, the government with the resources, with the power, with the personnel, with the doggedness and continuity to stick through. But those things haven't worked for a lot of communities. They've worked for some, but they've not worked for the people who are most vulnerable, who need them most. Let me turn to the elephant in the room. Since we're talking about urban renewal, we're talking about distressed neighborhoods and problems and crises and things that have not gotten better over the past 30, 40, 50, 60 years. The big question in the room is race. You mentioned lack of trust and how nothing gets done without trust. What do you see as being the potential for building trust, especially when it seems certainly to me that every year, even every month, there's some new sort of event or crisis that seems to set us back still further in a general sense in terms of building any kind of racial trust or solidarity. How does that work in the neighborhood revitalization movement?
This is a fantastic question. It's a very difficult question. And one of the reasons it's really difficult is, look, we just have to admit some things, Chris. We have to admit that some of the really, really damaging things that have occurred that have caused this sort of snowball effect, right, of destabilization really were a lot of know-it-all white people who were, deciding that this is where we're going to build the highway and this is the neighborhood we're going to knock down. And this is the way we're going to set up the welfare state, so that we can, quote unquote, help you. Right. And so there's real bitterness over that. And then I think there's also bitterness over being seen as a research experiment. So, you might have white researchers come in and say, oh, we want to help you and we want to fix you. And so it's this very superior mindset where you're like our subjects, you're like the mice in the experiment. And there's a sense of, what are you doing? Are you researching us? And then in many of those cases, their ideas didn't work. So they would leave the place worse than they found it. Hey, we're going to drop a strip mall here. Well, guess what? A strip mall didn't belong here. And now it's just a bunch of empty buildings that cause us a problem, right? And so there's a lot of built up bitterness that I think is very real. I do think that I would love, love, love to really see a renaissance in the Black church, because the Black church is still there. It still exists. It's still an institution. It has been weakened, but it's still there. And the traditional Black church, I want to be clear with people, the historical Black church is Baptist and Methodist mostly. Pentecostalism is a more recent sort of addition that came in the 20th century. But the historical Black church has a lot to offer in terms of I think, stabilizing families, encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging work, being kind of a nexus, right? What it once was, right? Sort of the place where you always went to do everything. All of your organizing, all of your art, all of your literacy. You did it all in the Black church. So I think that would be amazing. One way that might occur is through school choice, actually. So if we were to embrace the educational freedom movement, that would empower Black churches to start schools. I think that would be a huge step forward. Will stabilizing these neighborhoods involve Black people trusting white people more? And white people treating Black people with more respect? And I'm saying that specifically to liberals and progressives who are we've actually done studies showing that they talk down to Black people. They use simpler language. They tend to think of them as problems, etc. So this is not a conservative problem, right? It's a bigger problem than that. Yes, it will. It just will. Black Americans are 13% of the American population. The ones living in inner cities are a much smaller percentage, right? The majority of Black Americans are middle class. They're not in the inner cities, right? So this is a very small percentage of people. And that means that if you're going to connect with financial networks, employment networks, and others, you will need to develop relationships with white people for sure. And so I think one thing that we can do in terms of our approach to neighborhood stabilization is to have these bridge builders, right? People who can straddle both worlds. And this is often what your sort of missionaries are, these people who go in and move their families, move their lives into the inner city. They're a connection to these other networks that are much bigger and that people have been divided from. But they're also making themselves part of the neighborhood. And that can take a long time. It can take time to build trust. But it's really important because you do need those connections. That person doesn't have to be white. They could be Black. But there's only so many people to go around, right, in terms of getting all of this done. And so what do I say about, the constant drumbeat of racial tension? Oh, my goodness, I don't know. I mean, that is such a huge problem to solve. And I think maybe The only possibly little bit of hope that I could offer in that regard is that we are seeing a huge political shift along racial lines. So, Latinos are practically 50-50 at this point, politically speaking. There was for the Black community, what we saw was huge in terms of a shift, especially among Black males. Towards the right and conservatism. You're seeing the rise of Black conscious conservatism, which is a really interesting movement that is very aware of Black history while being conservative at the same time. Fascinating people, you can find them. Anyway, and so that shifting means more mixing. So that the old solidarity with the Democratic Party, this is a phenomenon called linked fate. Political scientists call it linked fate. And it just means I feel that I'm so much under duress that I have to vote as a voting bloc or we won't have any voice at all. The fact that that's breaking up seems to say, I don't know that we're under all that much duress anymore. We have these tough neighborhoods we want to help, but a lot of Black people are very, very successful. And they're kind of ready to walk away from that linked fate kind of phenomenon. And so that may cause a lot more mixing and conversation than we've had in a long time.
Yeah, I could see how that might generate some new social movements and possibilities, and maybe some resources. You mentioned one. I want to turn back to the question of church and state. And you've mentioned the church as an institution. It's weakened. It still has a vital role to play. It's probably best positioned to play a role. But we do have this sort of still kind of paradigm where we either approach the question politically or we approach it socially and religiously through these mediating institutions. And you've mentioned school choice as one, educational freedom movement as one way in which resources might be funneled into the Black churches who would be, take care of this 6-block area or people in this religious congregation. Are there any other ways that we can think of that are remotely plausible that resources, and I'm thinking especially resources that lead to jobs, might actually get into these areas, these specific concrete places that would involve, I don't know whether it involves some sort of partnership or some connection between the church who's there and the political authority, which tends to be either absent or ineffective. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'm much less sanguine when it comes to economic development being supported through the state. The thing with school choice is you hand the choice to the parents, right? So everybody just has the funding, the parents make the choice. The problem with state-sponsored economic development is that the state doesn't know who to support. They, as a matter of fact, most of what the state has done has been really harmful. So I mentioned the example of the strip mall being dropped in the middle of, a spot where it didn't belong. This is very common, right? The government boondoggle. But you also have problems like Dodd-Frank. I mean, this is really an interesting case where the Dodd-Frank regulations have made it impossible to operate as a small bank. You can't have small banks anymore. There are no new small banks. There are actually fewer banks than ever. We've gone from 10,000 banks to 6,000 banks in the United States, and community banks and credit unions can't even operate anymore. The ones that exist continue, but no new ones do. And if you hand out a mortgage for $100,000, it costs $10,000 to process that mortgage because of all the Dodd-Frank regulations, but you're only allowed to charge $5,000. Well, what does that mean? That means it's charity, to do that mortgage, right? So you might do a few, but you're not going to do them on a large scale. And so you see whole neighborhoods being bought up by Wells Fargo because Wells Fargo has cash. And people can't buy small mortgages or small business loans because those processing fees are too high. So a lot of what the state does actually undermines economic development, and they don't tend to actually know what will work. I think of Jane Jacobs, right, with her eyes on the street, and she talks about if you're gonna develop economically in a certain neighborhood, you better know the neighborhood. You better know the laundromat where everybody hangs out and chats, right? You better have the little coffee shop, and you build out from there. You can't come at it from a top-down perspective. And I'm just afraid that state intervention tends to always be too large of a scale. They're always trying to do too much at once. And so they're often not able to help that much. I suppose that nonprofits could could get grants, to do certain things. That might be okay. But even let's take True Charity as an example. They actually discourage it, because in so many cases you end up getting dragged off your mission by the special things that are required by the grant. Those grants can be extremely detailed, and if you get one thing wrong, you go on the bad list, right? Actually ends up ruining you. And of course, religious freedom, right? To the extent to which you can actually sort of be what you are as a nonprofit, if you are taking federal money. So I just get so much more nervous when it comes to economic development on those points.
Do you suppose there's another element of the trust issue at play here? Because when I mentioned lack of trust as a barrier, we both of our minds went right to, well, the people in the cities are not going to trust outsiders. They're going to be suspicious, and with some justification and a lot of history behind that. But it sounds to me there's another issue here at the level of not just condescension, but a kind of mistrust. I can't give money without strings to this group or to these people because they might use it well or they might use it poorly. And so I need a whole set of regulations. I need a whole set of rules and checkboxes and et cetera to supervise the grant and the spending of the money. Is that a trust issue, and could that be addressed perhaps from the government side, from the white side, as opposed to the black side?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I'm going to say something that's going to shock our listeners, because we are conservatives. But actually, work requirements and other forms of micromanaging, let's say welfare recipients, is actually a really good example of how it looks like smart policy, but it actually doesn't work out well at all. Yeah, so we're like you said, we're condescending. We're getting involved in every little piece of your life, and we're limiting how you can use that money. If you can't get it in a lump sum, you can't invest in capital, right? Maybe what you really need is a car, but instead, I'm just giving you little tidbits at a time. Or I'm taking it away the minute you get a 50-cent raise or whatever. And then I spend most of the money paying the middle-class bureaucrats that are tracking whether or not you work or don't work, or whether you're one of the people who's exempted from working. So it's one of those, it's one of those counterintuitive things where you think we should be doing all of this apron stringing with people, but actually it would be better sometimes to just say, hey, here is, a set thing for you to help launch you. And then it's hands off, right? And it's more of a laissez-faire. So there's lots of interesting conversation to be had around the way we do things like welfare policy, and maybe even things like federal grants that maybe we could experiment with that and get better outcomes.
Thanks. I recall Chris Arnott, among others, mentioning that in some ways that this happens with rural poverty as well, with the poor everywhere. It's almost as much a class thing as a race thing, is that upper middle class people sort of who deal in government policy and social policy are generalizing and universalizing the tools with which they are most familiar, which they navigate with ease. I can fill out my tax forms, right? Obviously, why can't everybody fill out their tax forms? Why can't people just fill out a 10-page form to get a grant and, file quarterly budgets to expense reports to show that they're fulfilling the grant? That's what I would do. I know I'm going on about this same issue, but is there a lack of solidarity or imaginative sympathy there that I just don't think about other people having a different set of values, different set of social experiences, which condition their ability to do the kinds of things, the kind of bureaucratic tasks which come relatively easily to people in my social class?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think so. And I see it every day. So I'm board president of Love the Lou, and we work with our own Josephs. We call them persons of peace. Many of these persons of peace run small nonprofits, or they run entrepreneurial endeavors. And the kind of regulatory requirements that would be annoying to you or I will absolutely be an obstacle that will stop them. And it is so frustrating to try and explain how hard these people are working and how much they are running on fumes. I mean, I know people who want to start a homeless transitional house that at the moment have people living in their own house. because they're just determined to help these people, and they're going to do it no matter what, no matter how hard it is on them, no matter how much it stresses them out. They're going to do it. Do they have a whole staff, a wing of lawyers to draw up all of this paperwork? No, they do not. No, they do not. Right. And so we've got to think about how to empower those people, because they're the real difference makers, but they're the least able to fill out all those forms. Let me tell you who can fill out all those forms and who does have that whole wing of lawyers. I don't want to mention names, okay, but some of these huge charitable organizations that are well known, and they're the movers and shakers, and they know all the House of Representatives guys, right? And they're getting all the money. Exactly. All right. And so they can do all that stuff. And then I will tell you, my friends who are working to do the bottom up work at the level of the block get so frustrated because these organizations are handing out hundreds of turkeys on Thanksgiving or whatever the grocery box is for the day. And you've got people lined up for miles, spending all day just sitting in line to get something. How does that feed into your human dignity? How does that develop you so that you can move on to something better? How does that relate to you as a person and not just a number? It doesn't, right? And so you're actively working against the kind of charity that really makes a difference. And so it's an uphill battle for those of us who want to do real block-based neighborhood stabilization work.
Right. Absolutely. No, thank you so much for that. Let me turn at the end of the interview here to the question of hope. I mean, the causes for hope, things that you see on the horizon, both in your own work and in some of the work that you've researched other people doing. You've spoken to me before we started about some of the profits of neighborhood stabilization. You've named some, and I will, by the way, just load up the show notes for this episode with links and names and a reading list for people who want to know more about a lot of the things we've been talking about. What do you see as being the hopeful side of the movement as you're taking part in it and writing about it today?
Yeah, I think that we are seeing these neighborhoods pop up that can be examples for people to point to. Robert Lupton's neighborhood in Atlanta is a fantastic example. He actually went to the legislature and said, I need you to give me the project so I can turn it into a mixed income neighborhood. And you've got to cap property taxes on all the residents who are already there. And they called it a Luptopia. They said, sure, we'll give it to you, but we doubt you can pull it off. Well, he pulled it off, right? And I shouldn't say he, but they, right? The whole neighborhood together pulled that off. So that's Focused Community Strategies in Atlanta. I think Love the Lou in St. Louis has done an amazing job of stabilizing the Enright block. They're now on their second neighborhood. Come and tour. If you're ever in St. Louis, I would love to give you a tour and show you what young people. We've got, the first 10 years is the building, right? And that's what's so hard to gain trust. But after 10 to 12 years on the Enright block, we had 50 kids who didn't join a gang, who didn't go to prison, who are getting jobs and going to school. It's a completely different future for them, completely different. And they'll say, hey, 2 blocks over, my friends thinks I'm corny. They think I'm corny. Well, but it's a price you can pay, right? If you can have a totally different life. And so you just keep walking through life with people. We're now at the corner of 4 neighborhoods. So we're very, very excited about what's happening there. The Chalmers Center, True Charity, right? I've mentioned some of those. They're on the cutting edge, right? So Chalmers is Brian Fickert's project out of Tennessee, and really great place to send your churches, for instance, to flip their mindset when it comes to, hand out versus hand up. But I do want to say what I love about somebody like Brian Fickert is that he's constantly pushing himself. So in his last book, he made this point. He said, I think it's called Becoming Whole. He said, what we're not trying to do is just hand the poor the quote unquote American dream of being rich, right? Of material well-being. We have to come into this with a totally holistic view of the human person. And success is about eudaimonia, right? It's about true well-being, and not just handing you resources, but I can hand you economic development. That's not enough either. right? There needs to be relational healing, like you mentioned, even racial healing, perhaps, right? Between going through some of our history and healing together on those things so that we can work together, so we can be part of one community. So I love the fact that these guys are pushing themselves. I really see them as being on the cutting edge. I think True Charity is on the cutting edge of asking, how can we flip our model, make it more dignified, more dignified, more dignified every time that we are evaluating ourselves. So yeah, so there's a lot of really great stuff out there that's happening.
That's fantastic. That's a great place for us to conclude as well. As I said, I'll get links from you to all the books that you've mentioned, to a reading list and a list of resources for people who want to know more about this, who'd like to support this, or come visit sometime and reach out to any of these people or to you. Thank you so much, Rachel. My guest today on The Sower has been Dr. Rachel Ferguson, Director of the Free Enterprise Center at Concordia University of Chicago, a longtime Ciceronian Society participant and a great friend of mine. Rachel, thanks again.
Thanks. This was a fun conversation.